Greetings, friends. Wanting here, and this is the weekly Russian-Ukrainian War Update for the week of June 30th through July 6th of 2025. And if you want to continue receiving these weekly Russian-Ukrainian War Updates, be sure to subscribe to my channel, give this video a thumbs up, comment your thoughts, share this video around, and let's get right into it. We're going to go right in our favorite area, the South Donetsk direction, where where most of the action is happening basically this week. This is I think one of the areas of the Russian offensive that is not the main issue. It's like one of the areas they're pushing to draw down draw Ukrainian forces away from the main area of attack, which is Pokrovsk and Kostiantynivka. But this is also where one of their most successful areas is. You know, they're also pushing in other areas. They're pushing in Lyman. They're pushing in Kupyansk and Kharkov. They pushed in Sumy. They're even now pushing in Zaporizhzhia again. But all those areas are small pittance. They're small gains, nothing too major, and the Ukrainians don't have, but aren't in that much danger in those directions. But in the South Donetsk direction, there's definitely a lot of things happening here that are that are giving the Russians a lot of gains. And this week is no different. Last week we talked about how the Russians took everything behind the Molka Yara and Volchka River, and I was talking about, well, how are they going to cross it? What are the Russian plans now that they reached, this river? And this, before I thought they would, maybe cross in this area near Tolstoya, Grushchivka, and try to outflank Piddubne and Myrnia. Well, it looks like the Russians said, we're going to just go straight to Piddubne. And that's what we did. Earlier this week, we saw the Russians cross the river and managed to take this tree line that's on the other side of this river. And not only that, we started getting confirmation, even from pro-Ukrainian sources like 2 or 3 days ago, that the Russians have captured the village of Piddubne. And it wasn't until today that the Russian Ministry of Defense and that the group of forces east confirmed it with the Russians raising their flags all over this village. So Piddubne has fallen. This is a very decent-sized village here, as you can see, and this is where the Russians could accumulate a lot of good forces so that they could then, expand. The hardest part was crossing this river. So now that the Russians have a position on the other side of this river, the Russians will have a very easy time reaching the next river, the Volga River, and luckily for them, in terms of liberating the rest of Donbass, this forms the border between the Donetsk border and the Dnipropetrovsk border. And now what's happening is the Russians, we talked about how last week, according to some sources, that the Russians have taken all these fields to the west of Fordivka and Vasola. So now they are basically right in the south of Myrnia, and with the fall of Piddubne, they have now captured everything to the north of Myrnia. So I wouldn't be surprised that by the end of next week, the Russians storm. They've been bombing this village of Myrnia pretty heavily, and I wouldn't be surprised if they storm it and manage to take it and have a very solid front line, positioning in this area so they could reach the Volga River. So right now the Ukrainians are still in full control of Myrnia, but this is definitely one of the next Russian goals. And yeah, very good job for the Russians for crossing. I was worried that maybe the Russians would have stopped on this river and would have maybe just stopped, but no, they are crossing the river in force and are now making a lot rapid progress. Also, according to pro-Russian sources, they have completely captured a village of Tolstoya here, a bit more of a smaller village. This is the village that I thought the Russians would focus on, but they have not. Now, we don't have 100% geolocated confirmation yet. We just have map updates, at least compared to Piddubne, which actually have geolocated footage. But I wouldn't be surprised if the Russians do take Tolstoya and this village of Grushchivka, which I think is just a village in name only. We get a lot of these on this map. Like if you scroll in, it's just this little forest. Like maybe there's like 2 or 3 houses here. Maybe it used to be a village here back in like the Soviet era, but then it it got depopulated. But in any case, we could definitely see the Russians, taking something like this in the next week or so. And then from here, all the Russians have to do is make a dash towards the Volga River, probably, take the village of Alexandrogard here. And then, the Russians are already cutting off the logistics. They bombed and destroyed the bridge that, connects Andriivka, Kletsovo to the other side of this Volga River. So they're making very much rapid progress here. So lots of good changes for the Russians in the South Donetsk direction. The Russians are also pushing north of Shemtenko. We actually have geolocated confirmation of the Russians being kind of more to the north of Shemtenko after they captured this village last week. And we just got the first update from a pro-Russian source, so the Russians have entered the village of Voskoranivka here. But we don't have any, again, no map, geolocated confirmation of that. But considering that, I wouldn't be surprised if the Russians did start moving north here using this road as for ease of advancements. And we did have GLK confirmation of the Russians being in these fields, between Volskarinivka, Shantamivka, Vasol, and such. So the Russians are definitely in these fields. It's just we don't know if they're actually in this village yet. So definitely, again, the main goal for the Russians here is, in my opinion, that they're going to reach the Volchka River, which will completely liberate the rest of South Donbass. And and something, at least take everything behind this red line. And I do think they're going to enter the Dnipropetrovsk Oblast just so, there's like this other village called Kupyansk here, which they need to take in order to actually liberate the rest of South Donbass, which means they'll have to take a few of these villages that are in the Dnipropetrovsk Oblast, but they'll probably take something up to the village of Sunsivka and Novoselivka here, or something like this. These would probably be the border, something like this. And then, just have, kind of like flatten the front with their positions down here. And then from there, we'll see what the Russians could do. The Russians could do a lot of things at that point. Maybe they cross the river, try to make a bridgehead here. I do think they're going to start trying to focus on Novopalovka just to take it. Maybe take Ivanovka. Maybe have, positions, maybe cross the river like they did on the Molka Yar River. There's a few decent-sized villages like Ivanovka, Havrolivka, Piddubne, decent-sized little towns here that, if the Russians could take it and take some of the tree, and everything in Novopalovka, which is split by the river as well, they could have a decent-sized bridgehead on the other side of this river, and then, but the Ukrainians have a very strong defense line beyond that, though. They have the village of the town of Prozny, Mezova, Volodymyrovka, Pokrovsk. These are very decent sized. If you look at Prozny, for example, there's high-rise buildings. There's a industrial zone. So there's and they have a rail line that connects them. So the Ukrainians have a very strong position here. And so if the Russians want to continue moving north here, they're going to have to go through a bunch of empty fields, which then will be saturated with drones. And so. It's going to be very hard for the Russians to try to take Mezova or Prozny if they want to continue moving this way. So I do think either the Russians stop on the other side of the Volchka River, or they maybe cross the Volchka River, make a bridgehead here with Ivanovka and these three villages, Novopalovka, but then they stop here, and then from here. But another place the Russians could do is start pushing kind of southwest here towards Uspenivka to start battling for Gallipoli and start trying to encircle this and help the Russians pull up the flank in Zaporizhzhia. That's another thing they could do. So. But right now, the focus is to liberate the rest of South Donetsk. So that is the South Donetsk direction. So that is where I think the South Donetsk direction will go, and we shall see how that develops. And then speaking of Zaporizhzhia, we're going to go to the Zaporizhzhia direction. The main thing here is there's two places to talk about when we talk about the Zaporizhzhia direction. The first is in the Gallipoli area, about the village of Malinovka. A lot of sources said that the Russians have completely captured this village. Now, we don't have GLK confirmation of the Russians being in the north here. We have Russians being in the south here, and even one geolocated of the Russians being in the center, but not in the north. It's not and then I think yesterday we got the Russians droning Ukrainian positions in the very north of this village. So we don't know if this village actually has been completely taken yet, but it's definitely not impossible that it has been taken, and it has been taken. I think I talked about last week about what the Russians will do at this point. Maybe try to take these villages, maybe start battling for Poltavka, just to start enveloping Gallipoli from the east here. But we still don't know if Malinovka has been completely taken, but the map updates say they have, but we still need we need some more evidence just to be 100% certain as to the positioning of the Russians in this area. And then the other area where the Russians are making a lot of progress is in the village of Kamyansky. Last week we talked about how the Russians like the south of Kamyansky, and this week the Russians have almost completely liberated this village. This is a very big gain for the Russians. It seems like the Russians knocked the Ukrainians out during a rotation. This week we had GLA confirmation of the Russians being here. So they've taken almost the entirety of the northern part of Kamyansk. They've taken everything like this week. So very much big gain for the Russians in the more Orekov area, near the most western part of Zaporizhzhia. The only part of Kamyansk they have not taken yet is this northern residential area here. They have a few high-rise buildings here. I do think the Russians will be able to take it and probably, take a few more of these dachas to the west here and probably take something like this. And then once they take this, they could take some of these ravines to the east of them, and then this would allow them to secure their more western flank as they move. Just as, for example, when they took Stopova, Mala, Sherbaki, Pitahaki, this taking of Kamyanska is just improving their western flank as they try to, start putting the pressure on Orekov here. But yeah, taking Kamyanska would be a very big gain for the Russians. But the thing is that the Ukrainians are going to now retreat to the next defense line in Stepanhersk here. But as you can see, there's a citadel here with a bunch of high-rise buildings. This is a fortress, and then if they even if the Russians take this fortress, there's a there's a river here. Not sure. Maybe there's not a river, but in any case, then Stepanhersk itself has a center with a lot of high-rise buildings. So there's I don't think the Russians are going to continue pushing towards this area because it's going to be very hard for them. Because then the Ukrainians if they try to advance towards Stepanhersk, the Ukrainians could use their positions a bit north here to attack the flanks here. So I do think they might just take Kupyansk and then stop. So, but that's my guess on what's going to happen in the Zaporizhzhia direction. But definitely the Russians still have to clear out one more district in Kupyansk, and then they'll be good. But yeah, this is just another where the Russians are now putting pressure on the Ukrainians just to prevent the Ukrainians from withdrawing troops from here to other fronts. Now that we're finished here, let us go to the Pokrovsk direction. And in the Pokrovsk direction, there's been some small changes. The biggest changes have been in this area where the Russians are now rapidly trying to encircle Pokrovsk from the east, or shall I say both Pokrovsk and Minigrad. When I say Pokrovsk, I kind of mean this entire Pokrovsk agglomeration, which includes Minigrad, even though they're technically two separate cities. And so this is where the Russians are mostly focused on. The biggest thing is that we have geolocated confirmation of the Russians completely capturing the village of Razine, which gives them a foothold on the other side of the river here, the Krinsky-Turetsk River. Now, just holding Razine itself is not enough. They have to improve their positions here to have a very solid bridge. They have to take Fedorovka, Bulovka, Novotoretska, and if they could take these villages here, they'll have a solid position to then start storming the main Ukrainian positions in Novokonomichnia with this giant Terrakon, and then in the town of Rodinsky here with the mine and other Terrakon here. Because if they could take these things, then they could cut the main supply road that supplies the Pokrovsk-Minigrad agglomeration, this highway here. So yeah, we shall see how that develops. And also we had geolocated confirmation finally of the Russians being right on the outskirts of Novotoretsk. But according to pro-Russian sources, the Russians have already taken most of Novotoretsk and have reached the river in this area here. And so we don't have any confirmation of that just yet, but we do know that the battle for Novotoretsk is ongoing, and the clashes for it are still going on. And but we will see if next week the Russians could actually fully take Novotoretsk. And the main goal for the Russians here is to take Novotoretsk and then take Bolievka, Fedorovka, and then have a bridgehead on the other side of this river. And then from here they could then accumulate forces and continue pushing south here. Now the thing here about this is that what the Russians could do is that the Ukrainians still have a lot of solid positions in the village of Shakovka, Volodymyrovka. As you can see, there's a pretty decent sized villages here, and so maybe the Russians want to move northwards here. Take Shakovka, Volodymyrovka, and then just secure their northern flank a little bit so that they can have some space between the Russian push down south a little bit, southwest here, to try to cut off Pokrovsk. Because if they take these villages I mentioned, just move south anyway, the Russians are in danger of just being attacked directly, and it's going to be very hard. But we shall see. Definitely the Russians will have to take these villages first, and then from here it just depends on if the Russians want to move north a little bit along the river and just to up to Shokovko and Novoshovkovko, and just kind of improve their have their northern flank push up a little bit, so that then they could have some space between the Ukrainian positions and then the Russians pushing towards Rodonsky and Novokonomichnia here. So yeah, the Russians are now trying to encircle this place from the east here, and we shall see how that develops. And then a little bit more to the south here, according to some, again, this is there's some rumors going around. We don't have any map or any updates, geolocated updates about this, but according to some pro-Russian sources, that the Russians are actually already entered the northern part of Novokonomichnia, are battling for this are having shooting battles in this northern part here, and trying to develop a position here, which again, makes sense, because if they took Razine, they also want to, improve their positions in the south here and have some positions here. But also, but we don't have any confirmation of that just yet. And then, according to the Ukrainians, is that they've actually completely recaptured the village of Mirolublovka. We have that because the Ukrainians we actually have, I think, a geolocated confirmation of the Ukrainians entering this village again. So, but I do think this is more of a gray zone, because it's not like, it could very well be that this is a contested area. It's not that, because the thing is, people could enter places all the time. It's just that, can they actually enter it, hold it, and actually have a solid defensive position there? So it could be that this area is more of a gray zone than it's first showed. So but we need more geolocated confirmation of the Ukrainians being here and getting bombed and such before we could actually say the Ukrainians have retaken this. Because if the Ukrainians have taken this, this does hold back the Russians from trying to enter Novokonomichnia from the east here directly. So they have to take this village first in order to actually move here. So we shall see how that develops. And then a little bit to the more western part of the Pokrovsk direction, there's actually not really been that much changes. There's been, Udashna, the battle for Udashna is still ongoing, but there's been no changes from last week. The battle for Zeronia is still ongoing, but there's been no changes from last week. The only change that I think happened was that the Russians improved their positions on the rail line between Shemchanivka and Novoukrayinka, taking this area right here. So it looks like the Russians are, I've always thought they would do this, just use this rail line just to slowly but surely have better positions, maybe take Novoukrayinka, just improve their positions here a little bit. But, so the Russians are just, improving their positions in Pushan and Shemchanivka a little bit, just to put some distance between the Ukrainian positions in Pokrovsk itself and towards the main Russians' villages where they're accumulating forces. So we shall see, but besides that, there's been no really other changes in the Pokrovsk direction. Even in the area towards Novopalovka, there's been no changes. So that is what's happening. Alrighty, now we are going to go to the Kostiantynivka direction, and this is the other main area where the Russians want to take for this offensive. And this week in Kostiantynivka, there's actually been not that much changes, but the biggest changes, again, like last week, has been in the Chasiv Yar area which is now part of the Kostiantynivka direction, as I mentioned. But in Chasiv Yar, there's been a lot of big changes. The biggest thing in this area is that the Russians have completely captured what they call the Shemchenko micro-district, which is part of the Chasiv Yar area, this area right here. We talked about the Russians already weren't in the Shemchenko micro-district, but they didn't take most of it. But this week we had geolocated confirmation of the Russians being in the very center of it, I believe, here. And so most map updates have shown that this Shemchenko micro-district has been taken. Along with this other, I think they call it the number 2 micro-district or something, which is this area right here. We had geolocated confirmation of the Russians being in this kind of quarry right here. So this does show that the Russians have indeed taken this micro-district in the south here. And along with this, some pro-Russian sources are saying that the Russians have completely captured also the village of Mykolaievka. Now, this past week, we had a geolocated confirmation that of the Russians bombing the Ukrainians on the western part of Mykolaievka. So it does show that the Ukrainians are still in Mykolaievka, but I wouldn't be surprised if the Russians have actually entered this village and are now battling for Mykolaievka and have taken maybe at least the eastern part of this village. The Russians just have to take, as you can see, Mykolaievka is pretty elongated. I think it kind of like stretches all the way back here and such. The Russians don't have to take this one street village. I think at most they have to take the eastern and center part of Mykolaievka here, because at that point, then they kind of could link up, with their forces in this northern micro-district. And then from here, they could close up shop on this forest, which is, where the Ukrainians are accumulating all our forces. Because they have to take this forest out, because if they don't clear this forest, which is, I think, technically part of Chasiv Yar, is that the Ukrainians could then just continue launching raids in the center of Chasiv Yar. They could launch raids into the Shemchenko micro-district. So what the Russians have to do is take the center of Mykolaievka, which is what they're doing now after the fall of the Shemchenko micro-district, and then, try to just use this road to try to just take this small part of the forest, and then, fully cut off the Ukrainians that are in this forest and then liquidate it. So then that the main Russian positions are, let's write it, something like this. And then from here, they could say that they have liberated Chasiv Yar. But after this point, there's one more micro-district the Russians have to take called the Yuzhny micro-district, which is a bit more to the south here, and it's this micro-district right here, which is to the north of Stupichki. I thought this was part of Stupichki, but apparently not. But in any case, the Russians will have to take this part just so, they continue pushing the Ukrainians farther and farther away from Chasiv Yar. And the main thing is that they want to push the Ukrainians back to Chernovo. And there's, as you can see, there's I don't have the map up here, but as I showed in the last video, there's a bunch of trenches that are to the right in front of Kostiantynivka. If you look, there's just a bunch of trench networks all in front of Kostiantynivka. So the Ukrainians have could retreat to these defensive lines, but the thing is, if they do that, the Russians will have the high ground, and the Ukrainians will be on the low ground. So it'll be a lot harder for the Ukrainians to defend. But it does seem like the Chasiv Yar is about to fall. This battle's been going on for over a year now. And so it's going to be very interesting to see how the Russian, if the Russians are going to take Mykolaiv and liquidate the forest and take the Yuzhny micro-district. But so far, a lot of big gains for the Russians this week. We have confirmation of the Russians being taking this micro-district. We have most updates showing that the Shintemka micro-district has been taken, that the Russians are now bound for Mykolaiv. So we shall see how the battle for Chasiv Yar continues to develop, and how it will finally end, hopefully. And then a bit more to Konstantinivka itself, a bit more in the Toretsk area. Some updates: the Russians are now apparently have a foothold in Bilohora. Bilohora is like a very small village. It's like a one-way street village here. But again, the Russians are, once they took a bunch of the trenches that are on the other side of this, on this canal here, they started, using positions near Delivka to start taking everything to the south of this river here. As you can see, there's a river right here, the Nemunivka River, and they've actually entered Bilohora and captured some houses in this area here, which makes sense. So we shall see how the Russians develop that. There's the main center part of Bilohora is in this area right here, and so maybe the Russians continue using, pushing northwards, using the river as defense. But then if they do that, the Ukrainians still have positions in this northern area right here where they can attack the Russians, and then, or the Russians could use Delivka to move up north using the river here and try to enter from here. But then again, there's Ukraine positions in Alexander Shuchina, which they could advance. So right now the Russians are a bit of a pickle. If they want to take Bilohora, then if they take Bilohora, then their flanks will be exposed. So it's a bit, right now they've entered Bilohora, but they need to improve their positions along this canal if they want to actually take it and be secure in their taken here. Another thing that's interesting, which I think is a lie, so the Russians said they've taken the village of Pruchishnia here, which I think is fake news. I don't think they've actually taken this village right here. So I think it's just someone in the Ministry of Defense command or someone on the front over-exaggerating their claims of victory here just to get more brownie points. So we shall see how that develops here. But yeah, I don't think Pruchishnia has actually fallen to the Russians. But I could be wrong. I'm waiting for GLK confirmation. And then also a bit more in the Toretsk area, GLK confirmation of the Russians taking this tree line to the south of this kind of quarry here that the Russians took. I do think now that the Russians probably have a very solid position to be able to actually take this giant mine shaft, which the Russians could use as a forward operating base. But again, since the Ukrainians are still in Sherbriki, Novospatsky, it very much hampers the Russian ability to supply this area to the north here. They really need to improve their positions in this area in order to actually liquidate this pocket here. And then more to the actual kind of where there used to be a lot of updates is that the battle for Alexander Kalinova is still ongoing. We had JLK confirmation of the Russians bombing the most northern part, so it does seem like this area is still being contested. But we shall see. We're still waiting for more JLK confirmation just to get more to get an idea of like where exactly positions are. Are the Ukrainians still in full control of this? Are the Russians still in control? Is this more of a gray zone? We shall see. But yeah, there's been a big slowdown in this direction here. But yeah, we shall see if the Russians are in control of Alexander Kalinovo. Alrighty, now we are going to go to the Seversk direction, and there's been some small changes. The main thing is that the battle for Srebrenica is still ongoing. The Russians are in the center of this village. Again, as I mentioned last week, is that the Ukrainian positions in this forest allow them to do raids on Srebrenica, and because the Russians have not captured the rest of this hill here, attacking Sherebrenka makes them in the lowlands, and so the Russians have, I think, in order to actually take Sherebrenka, they'll have to take the rest of this hill here. But the Russians did make some small progress, and this means they're securing at least their gains in Gordivka here. We had some geolocate confirmation of the Russians taking some of this area right here. So again, as I mentioned last week, I showed you the elevation map, and this area is the high ground here. So they have to take the high ground in this hill here, and then take a bit more of this hill here to be able to secure Sherebrenka here. But yeah, we shall. But yeah, Sherebrenka is still ongoing. The Russians are slowly but creeping upwards and upwards. I say if they want to actually take Sherebrenka, they have to take the rest of this hill here, and then from here they'll be able to actually maybe actually take Sherebrenka, and and then from here start trying to develop their offensive to try to cut off northern Seversk here. And then in the Lyman direction, the Russians have been slowed down, but they are actually pushing back the Ukrainians that are trying to dislodge them. Last week we talked about the Ukrainians re-entered the village of Rikadup and entered the center, pushed the Russians almost entirely out of the village except the most eastern part. But this week, most map update mappers are saying that the Ukrainians were pushed out of Rikadup, and the Russians retook this village. Yeah, it looks like the Ukrainians have not been able to actually push the Russians fully out of this, and looks like the Russians are fighting back for this town. This is a very important town because the Russians needed to actually secure their northern flank as they push southwards here. So we shall see how that develops. And then, according to most map updates, is that the Russians are continuing improving their positions in the village of Kharkovka. Now, the thing with Kharkovka is that it's split in half by this reservoir. We talked about last week or a month ago that the Russians were actually in the western part of Kharkovka, but they got knocked out by the Ukrainians. So it looks like the Russians were like, okay, we're not going to cross the river because that harms logistics. We're just going to capture everything to the east here. So they've captured more of the eastern part of Kharkovka here. Maybe they leave the western part of the Ukrainians and they just continue using this kind of reservoir as a defense as they move southwards. But again, if the Ukrainians continue trying to attack Rikadup, it's going to threaten their northern supply routes a lot. So I do think what the Russians have to do is take Rikadup and probably also enter the village of well, I guess Gluzhinovka is on the other side of this river, but in any case, they just need to reach the river here, and this will give them a natural defense from Ukrainian attacks here. And then just move northwards here and just improve their positions here. Along with this, after the village capture of Gerkovka last week, the Russians have not improved their positions in the fields here. There's a bunch of trench networks here. I think you could actually see it here, maybe not. But there's a bunch of you can see it. There's you can see these trenches in this area here. But in any case, if the Russians want to take the rest of the Luhansk Oblast and not just take the village itself, they have to take the fields. They have to push northwards a little bit more, but as you can see, I think they took Gerkovka and then just kind of paused. But we shall see how that develops. And then I've actually kind of combined some areas. The Kupyansk and Kharkov directions are now kind of similar. So I'm going to now say that everything to the south of this area from Krontolovka downwards is part of the Lyman direction, and then everything to the north here is part of the Kupyansk-Kharkov direction. So we shall see how that goes. However, because of that, we're still in the Lyman direction here, and because of that, there has actually been some changes in the Ukrainian favor. Last week we talked about there were some changes in the Russian favor, how the Russians improved their positions to the north of Klishchinovka here, and actually managed to take this forest here, take the northern part of Klishchinovka back, and actually enter the village of Gluzhovsko from the south. But so I thought they're improving their positions here, but there has now been a change in the Ukrainian favor, and we should have seen this coming because 2 or 3 weeks ago we saw that the Ukrainians were in this tree line here. I'm like, maybe there was some before that we saw the Russians were in this area here, and I'm like, well, how did the Ukrainians manage to enter this area? Maybe there was some counterattack and the Russians they got behind the Russian lines. But maybe all in all, though, it's maybe they got liquidated. But that is not what happened, because this week we had geolocate confirmation that the Ukrainians were in the village of Zaporizhzhia here, and they pushed the Russians completely out of this village, and the Russians retreated back to the village of Krulatovka here. So it does show that the Russians were they're not in Nova Krulovka, they're not in Zaporizhzhia. So the southern part of this kind of bridgehead, the salient here, is more less in Russian favor than we first assumed. So, the Russians are very much trying to continue the splitting of the Kupyansk and Lyman directions, but it's definitely, the Ukrainians are attacking them from both sides, and it's a salient, so it's definitely a lot of hard work for the Russians to continue keeping their positions in this area. Anyway, now we're going to go to the Kupyansk-Kharkov direction, and this week we actually have very much interesting news. In this area, the main biggest thing is that the Russians have crossed the international border in the Kharkov region and have completely captured the village of Milova here. We have the Russians raising their flags in this village. It's a pretty decent-sized village, and along with this, according to most even pro-Ukrainian sources, they have improved their position along from beyond this and taken a bunch of these tree forest belts and tree lines to the west of this village. So, a very good, decent progress for the Russians, crossing this border. Maybe this is just another pressure point. Maybe this was just a position to, how do you say it, to split Ukrainian forces, and maybe they won't advance anymore. But if they do advance, what I do think is that what the Ukrainians are going to try to do here is try to link up with Russian positions in this area. Maybe what I think what we'll do is the Ukrainians are going to try to take the Russians will try to take the village of Cherninovka here, and then from here try to break through towards the village of Villa Kuluvka here. This is a pretty decent sized town as well, where the Russians could accumulate forces, and from this they'll be able to have a very solid position on the other side of the Russian-Ukrainian border, and they have a highway here which the Russians could use for supply purposes. And then from here, I do think also the Russians will continue pushing toward a village of Obrania, Kanatnya, try to just, protect the southern flank of the Russians here. And then from here, I think the main goal for the Russians is to then try to reach the village of Ubadovki, Kolodozgo, and as you can see from here, there's a river that splits kind of this position here. Let me show you the river. The river kind of goes something like this. And so I think what the Russians are going to try to do, and then I think it stops around this point, but anyway, I do think what the Russians are going to try to do is try to reach this river and, push the Ukrainians out from everything along the border here and try to take this piece of Kharkov Oblast. If the Russians do indeed try to improve their positions there, because it could be that they just enter this village just to drive Ukrainian forces here and try to drive them away from, the Dorishnya area, from the Volchansk area. So we shall see how that develops here. But, so far they took Milova, which is a very good gain for the Russians, but we shall see if they could develop further beyond that. And then in the Kupyansk area itself, today, actually on Sunday, we had they say, this is again the Russians lying here. They say they took the village of Sobolovka here. Again, we don't even have confirmation that they take Moskovko here, so I do think this is bullshit. All we know is that the Russians are in Kirovsky and are around in the fields around Globovko here. And I could buy that they take Radivka here. I do think at maximum, I think the Russian positions are something like this. But I could buy that the Russians are still being contested in this area because they're so, they haven't actually improved their positions in the here, so the Ukrainians continue counterattacking. So I do think it's going to be hard for the Russians to be able to hold on here. But, at maximum, I do think the Russians have something like this. But in terms of taking Solobovko and Moskovko, I think that is bullshit. I don't think the Russians are actually in this area here. So this is, again, when the Russian commanders here lie, shows that they're not as good as... they're not good. They're more important with trying to look good than actually doing good. And then a bit more, now that we've combined kind of the Kupyansk and Kharkov directions, we're going to talk about, there's been no changes in the, kind of the Volchansk area. The only thing is that the Russians have, I think we talked about this last week, that the Russians crossed the river here and are trying to battle for this kind of industrial zone, but there's been no changes since then, so we shall see if maybe the Russians got pushed back or anything, so we shall see. And then lastly, but not leastly, well, actually leastly, except for Kherson, is that the Sumy direction, there's actually not been that much change. It looks like the Russians kind of slow down here. The main big thing this week is that the Russians have basically kicked the Ukrainians out of Techno, the village of Techno here in the Kursk area. We had JLK confirmation of the Russians, taking some of these tree lines in the border region here, taking this tree line. So before the Ukrainians crossed this border and were attacking Techno directly, and they were also trying to take Techno from the east here. And so there was a lot of, they were trying to take Techno as a starting point to have a position here because it's a pretty decent-sized town. But it looks like the Russians were able to stop the Ukrainians trying to take Techno in their tracks here. So good for the Russians there. But in terms of actually Sumy itself, there's been no really big changes. The Russians are still clashing for Andriivka, and the Ukrainians, we don't know if this is in the gray zone. We had GOK confirmation like 3 weeks ago, the Ukrainians being here, but then now we've been getting GOK confirmation of the Ukrainians bombing the Russians in the northern part of this village. So it looks like Andriivka is still in the gray zone and such. We had GOK confirmation of the Russians being in Novomykolaiivka, at least in the most southern part of it, so it does show that this village is under Russian control. But besides that, there's been no really other changes in the Sumy direction. And that is it for this week. Hope you guys enjoyed. Be sure to subscribe to my channel if you want to continue receiving these weekly Russian nuclear updates. Be sure to subscribe to my channel. Give the video a thumbs up. Comment your thoughts. Share this video around. And I hope you have a wonderful day. So aim high and wander on.